Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Doctrine Dialogues. I'm your host, Paul Bollinger, and today I would like to follow up in our series on slavery in the Bible. I have two videos on that so far, and basically my main point is that this is not a perfect world. And so God created a nation. He created the nation of Israel. And he created laws for that nation, which we have in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And the laws that God created there, um, they're not a perfect world laws. They're laws for a nation that lives in a broken and sinful world. And so God does allow slavery in the Pentateuch. It's very clear that God does not want people to force others into slavery, steal them and force them into slavery. And God even sets up slavery in a way that no Israelite, no Hebrew living in the nation of Israel should ever become a slave for life, the way the law is set up. It's set up that Hebrews can be slaves for 6 years, and then in the 7th year they go free. So at most, Hebrews will serve as a slave for 6 years, and then they go free, and they go free with blessings, which with enough resources so that they shouldn't have to serve as excuse me, as a slave again. So that's great for the nation of Israel. God sets it up in a way that its citizens won't become slaves, at least perpetually, and even as slaves, they have rights. They are to be treated well, and if they aren't treated well, they are to be set free for things like, permanent physical injury. Uh, and that's all well and good, but then we get to Leviticus 25, and it says here that Israelites can buy people from other nations and keep them as slaves indefinitely. So the law of holding a slave for only 6 years, that applies to only Hebrews, to only Israelites. But there's another law that says, well, if you buy a slave and they're not an Israelite, yes, you can keep them forever. And at that point, you got to be thinking, well, great, God, you had a good thing going. You can only keep slaves for 6 years. Why would you let Israelites have slaves forever? Great if you're an Israelite, you're not going to be a slave forever, but they can just buy them from other nations and keep them forever. And again, my argument is that God is making laws for a broken and far from perfect world, and these laws are intended to improve life. They're not intended to make heaven on earth. That's not the intention. The intention is to make life better. And so my argument would be that the reason God does this is because other nations are going to make slaves of people regardless of what the Israelites do, right? There will always be slaves in other nations. I think it makes sense that it would be better to be a slave in the nation of Israel, where slaves have rights, where you can't just, treat a slave like cattle. For example, when a man strikes the eye of his slave and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. That applies to Israelite slaves, who are only slaves or indentured servants for 6 years, and non-Israelite slaves, who are slaves for life. Same thing if you knock out a tooth of a slave, they should go free. In other words, if you cause any permanent physical injury to a slave, they go free. In the same way, if a man strikes a slave and he dies, you are to kill that slave owner. That slave owner shall be avenged. So in other words, they are treated like human beings, these slaves are treated, you can't just kill them like cattle. Their lives have value, to the point that if a slave master intentionally kills a slave, you are to kill that slave master. And so, being a slave in the nation of Israel would be far better than, let's say, being a slave in the nation of Egypt, where the Egyptians, what did they do? They worked the Israelites to death, literally, and they took their male children and threw them into a river, threw them into the Nile River to kill them, so that they could keep the population of the Israelite slaves down. And so I just want to point out, even if you're a slave, a non-Israelite slave, and you are enslaved to an Israelite for life. So let's say, the worst situation here in Leviticus 25, you are a non-Israelite slave, enslaved to an Israelite in the nation of Israel. Yeah, you will be a slave for your entire life. And at first that sounds really bad, and then you realize, well, that's a lot better than being a slave in Egypt. And that's a lot better than being a slave in anywhere else in the earth. And so what I think God did is God allowed slavery in Leviticus 25, and He allowed Israelites to purchase non-Israelite slaves forever and keep them as slaves forever. And the reason that He did this is because slavery in Israel was better than being a slave outside of Israel. And if God did not allow Israelites to keep slaves forever, then Israelites would not be able to afford those slaves. All right? So let's think about it this way. When an Israelite sells himself into slavery, he's selling himself for at most 6 years, and the price of his slavery reflects that. So let's say, I don't know, let's say an Israelite sells himself, we'll say 6 years labor, $30,000 a year. We're talking, U.S. American dollars here, to give it some context. So $30,000 a year, 6 years, 6 times 30 is 180,000. So let's say an Israelite slave sells himself for $180,000 to pay off his debts, and he works for 6 years. The guy has a lot of debt, so he has to sell himself for 6 years. He sells himself for $180,000. And let's say, now there's other slaves out there. Let's say they're $250,000, $250,000, and they're slaves from other nations that are to be sold. They're slaves for life. Well, from an Israelite perspective, if you're buying this slave, how are you going to afford him if you can only keep him for 6 years? In other words, let's say the price of a slave is twice as much as the price of an Israelite slave, and you can only keep both of them for 6 years. Well, no one's going to buy these slaves from other nations. And so I think what God did is He said, look, no one's going to buy slaves from other nations, which is really sad, because in these slaves will end up working for masters outside of Israel, and they will be treated like cattle. And so again, I think what God is trying to do is improve the situation on earth. And He's looking at these slaves who will be sold to someone, somewhere, and God says, well, I'd rather have them be sold to my nation, where they don't get treated like cattle, where they have rights. But I know that if I only allow the Israelites to keep them for 6 years, then they are only going to offer the slave traders prices for 6 years. And the slave traders will know that they're selling slaves. They want to sell slaves for the rest of their lives, so they will offer prices that are probably twice, if not more, than the Israelites are willing to pay. Because why would you pay, twice as much for a slave that you can only keep for 6 years, And so God says, you know what? The only way Israelites are going to buy slaves is if I let them keep them for life. It is better for the slaves that are being bought if they are bought by Israelites than by other nations. And so God says, it's not a perfect world, but the way that we can make this world better, even for the slaves from other nations that are going to be slaves for their whole lives, is to make sure that my people have an opportunity to buy them. Because under my people and my nation, under my laws, these slaves who are slaves for life, will live a better life than if they were bought somewhere else. Because in my nation of Israel, slaves have rights. So I hope that explains here why in Leviticus 25, I hope that adds a little bit of understanding as to why God allowed slavery for a slave's entire life, as long as a slave was not an Israelite. Hope that made sense. If you have questions, please leave them in the comments. Again, I am not the Pope. I am not infallible. I am not perfect. But I do love discussion on the Bible and questions because it helps us all understand things better. Thank you guys for joining me. Have a great day.